My mother has gone missing, and yet entrapped in a strange apartment, unable to leave. Chapter 36. 3 days. It had been 3 days. 3 days of waiting, without a single word. 3 days of Samuel disappearing, leaving me behind with my thoughts. It had been 3 days of complete and utter torture. We'd left the hospital soon after Samuel revealed to me that my mother had gone missing. From there, he brought me straight to a small apartment that sat in the middle of town, for what seemed like hours. He grew a litany on everything I knew about James, who he was, how he met my family, where he used to live. The only problem was that I had no idea about any of it. I was too young to remember living anywhere but this town, and consequently too young to remember my mother meeting James. He never spoke of it. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was a tortuous thought to realize that it took my mother's disappearance for anyone to see that James was a complete stranger. I hadn't seen anyone but Samuel since we arrived in his apartment. Apparently, despite the circumstances, Riley insisted my sentence of house arrest stayed intact. This resulted in Samuel leaving me alone on a daily basis, for hours at a time. He told me he was searching for my mother, and I could only hope he was telling the truth. The thought of escaping and finding her on my own crossed my mind more than once, but every time I tried, something got in my way. Either Samuel would come home early, a door would be locked, or someone would be standing just outside the apartment. Samuel told me Riley insisted on having a few men guard me during the day, for my own safety. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Another day had come and passed, and it was night once again. I was sitting upright in the bed, staring blankly at a book Samuel had given me, though it was the first new novel I'd seen in years. I couldn't pay attention to it. There was no escaping this reality, no matter how desperately I tried. The sound of voices just outside my bedroom door echoed through my ears. They were tense, though careful not to rise in volume. It was easy to distinguish who the voices belonged to Samuel and Riley. I perked at their arrival, hoping I would be able to catch a glimpse of what was going on outside this apartment. Samuel updated me every day on what was happening, but he could never tell me much. Nothing had changed. There were no leads. Carefully and quietly, I crawled out of bed. Tan sheets wrapped around my ankles and threatened to trip me, but I didn't let them. My hands gripped the bed posters that shot up to the ceiling, allowing my balance to stay intact. When steadied, I padded my way across the small room, staying as silent as possible. I knew that Samuel and Riley would sense my presence at the slightest of disturbances, and I wanted to hear their conversation before that happened. Thankfully, the path to the door was a straight shot. It's right next to the door leading to my bathroom, so I knew if I got caught I could use that as an excuse. As well, I heard Samuel's voice the minute I leaned against my bedroom door, holding my ear to the opening. "I don't understand." Riley immediately responded. "There's nothing to understand. Samuel, it's my decision. You have to support it. I know that. But this is Samantha we're talking about." I heard a heavy sigh from Riley. "You know the only reason I let this happen was because it's your mate. Samuel, if it were Eden, it'd have done the same thing. But we can't do it anymore, and you've got to know that. We've got the best trackers out there looking. And for what? A human and a wanderer." Riley suddenly scoffed. "Do you know how ridiculous that is?" "It's not ridiculous." Samuel raised his voice slightly. "And if this were Eden, you would have done all of this and more." "Maybe," Riley mused, unaffected. "But I've made my decision. I won't have the pack putting themselves out there for a human who's probably already dead. Or even better, turned." My breath hitched and a mangled cry threatened to emerge from the back of my throat. I plastered my hand over my mouth the minute I felt it, and thankfully, no noise was made. Samuel's voice was pleading now, though still raised. "She won't be able to handle this. Her family is all she has. She's got you. To you, Samuel. I suddenly heard Riley's voice much closer than before. And I'm sure she will be just fine. Abruptly, the door was pulled open, causing me to quickly stumble forward. I caught my footing before I could trip. However, gripping the wall beside my door. When I had my footing, I didn't move from that position in the doorway. Taking the moment to gather my thoughts, Riley caught me eavesdropping on an important conversation, and I wasn't sure how he would respond. Silence stretched for a short minute as the two men stared at me, Samuel slightly surprised. After a moment, he rolled his eyes. Was that necessary? I opened my mouth but realized he was speaking to Riley, who shrugged and moved away from me, back towards the kitchen. Samuel was standing not too far away from him, leaning all his weight against the white countertop. You'll be fine, won't you, Samantha? Riley called out. He hadn't stopped in the kitchen like I thought he would, but instead continued walking towards the front door, which stood at the point where the living room and kitchen met. The door matched the color of Riley's eyes, and compared to the neutral colors of the rest of the apartment, they were both extremely out of place. I tensed as Riley turned back to face me, his amber eyes meeting my own. Over the past few days, it had occurred to me that Riley could have easily been the one to take my mother. It would explain why they hadn't found even a trace of her, along with many other things. But I never got the chance to confront him about it. I managed to not worry by telling myself that I hadn't broken the deal, and there was no reason for Riley to have taken my mother. Still, to my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was a worrying concept that plagued my vacant days. Riley, Samuel called out, stalking towards him. We're not through with this. Riley shot me a wild grin before blatantly ignoring Samuel and slipping out the front door. Samuel followed him through the opening, cursing as Riley walked down the hall and further away from the confrontation. I watched as Samuel's body stopped in the doorway, his hands gripping the frame in clear annoyance. After another slew of curses, Samuel hung his head inside. He didn't go after Riley, and I watched him carefully as he retreated from the door and came back to the kitchen. He leaned against the counter again, running a hand down his face. When he refused to meet my or even glance my direction, I knew something was wrong. What's going on? I asked quietly. His eyes flickered to me, but as soon as they did, he turned his back and started rummaging through the fridge. After a moment, he brought out 2 bottles of water, setting them on the counter. He gestured for me to take one. I slowly walked towards the bar stools and sat in the one directly across from Samuel. We had an entire counter between us, and I suddenly felt as if he was thousands of miles away from me and this conversation. Samuel only added to this notion when he put his hands on the edges of the counter and leaned as far back as his arms would allow. What's going on? I repeated with a little more force. You're not going to like it. I don't care if you're not going to like it. Tell me. For the first time that day, his eyes met mine. Riley has decided to call off the search. What? To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Everything was slowly starting to make sense, and I cowled and helped the bitterness that laced my tone. Why? Because my mother and I are only human. Because she's probably already dead. My voice broke on my last word. And as it happened, Samuel swiftly leaned across the large white surface, closing the distance between us. He cowled at reach me, but his hands snaked forward. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I'm sorry, Samantha. I'm so sorry. I tried to change his mind. That was you trying to change his mind. I questioned in disbelief, remembering the brief conversation he'd heard. You barely said 3 sentences. You practically let him waltz out of here without a second glance. That's not true. I've been trying to talk to him all day and you just heard. I don't care. I sharply cut him off, standing at the same time. If you won't look for my family, I will. She's not dead. You don't know what you're talking about. I started walking towards the front door, even though I knew Samuel would stop me. Sure enough, he was blocking my path before I could step 2 feet away from the kitchen counter. He firmly gripped my upper arms, and as he did, I sent him a harsh glare. Let me go. I know you're upset. Let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. You're going to do exactly what Riley asks? Are you not? Samuel groaned. It's not that simple. Samantha. Cheers, my alpha. I can't just, are you not? Cutting him off again. At this point, my anger was burning so brightly that I didn't care about the amount of disrespect I was showing him. Nor did I care about any consequences that would come later. The only thing I could focus on was the fact that Samuel was giving up on my mother. I wouldn't accept that. Yes, but I should have known. I cut him off again. One word from your precious alpha and the world stopped spinning. Have you even been looking for her? Do you even care? Will you let me speak? Samuel growled, cutting me off. No, I growled back. Because all you're going to do is defend Riley and his decision to give up on my family. He sighed heavily, his grip easing slightly on my arms. I haven't given up. Samantha, I've been looking for her non-stop. You know that. But I don't know what else to do. Riley's right. We've searched everywhere outside the territory and can't find a single trace. No other pack has seen them. There's no trail. Chess disappeared. That's right. Have you ever thought to look inside the territory? Have you really searched everywhere? How can you know that Chess gone when it's only been 3 days? Samuel groaned, hanging his head back. No one should be this hard to find. Samantha, why would she be inside the territory? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbe, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. James wouldn't be that stupid or reckless. If that were the case, we'd have found them days ago. His slight annoyance only fueled my fire, causing me to say something before I could think. Maybe James didn't take her. Samuel snapped his head back to look at me. What is that supposed to mean? His grip tightened again. I squirmed underneath him, very aware of what it just suggested. I immediately tried to take it back. Nothing. I didn't mean anything. I'm just trying to find an explanation. Yes, you did. What are you saying? Do you think someone from the pack took her? I bowed my head, realizing his train of thought was going exactly where I didn't want it. Even though my mother was missing, I still had Will to worry about. If Samuel told Riley what he'd just said, it would be over for my brother. I don't know. It was a stupid suggestion. Tell me why. I was silent. I refused to speak. I could tell Samuel was going to let this go, just by the grip he had on my arms. It was uncomfortably tight now, and I could tell he knew I was keeping something from him. In this moment, there were no words I could say that would remedy his suspicions. After a few minutes of painful and tense silence, Samuel abruptly released his grip on me. I stumbled backward a few steps, but Samuel stayed in place. His hands raised and I flinched involuntarily, but they only came down to rest on the back of his neck. When he noticed my reaction, he stiffened. Samantha, what aren't you telling me? Surprisingly calm, begged me for an answer. Nothing. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. I was quiet for a moment before I softly spoke. There's nothing to talk about. And it was true. I could never tell Samuel what Riley threatened. I didn't know what Riley would do, but I was almost certain it would include the ending of my life and many others. What do you want me to do? Samantha. I looked up to find Samuel staring at me, my hand wrapped around my arm, and I hugged myself closely. I just want to find her. I know. She can't be dead. Samuel was silent. Tears stung my eyes. I firmly blinked them away, bowing my head and letting my dark hair fall forward to shield my face. Samuel noticed, however, and took a hesitant step forward. When I didn't move, he closed the distance between us. A finger was placed underneath my chin, and he gently raised my head to meet his gaze. A sad expression lined his features and his mouth was hanging half open as if he was fighting to find the right words to say. Despite my best efforts, the tears starting flowing. Samuel watched them slip, catching a few as his other hand cupped my cheek. As they continued falling, all my anger and resolve disappeared. The only thing left in their wake was a terrified girl who wanted her mother. Samuel smiled sadly, noting my change. We'll find her. I haven't given up. They'll find a way to fix this. There's no fixing this. Samuel, I whispered, the first of many sobs escaping my lips. Samuel hushed me, smoothly wrapping his arms around my body in a gentle embrace. I was still holding myself, but Samuel didn't seem to care about my awkward position. He held me firmly against his chest, one hand cradling the back of my head. His chin rested on the top of my skull, and it suddenly felt as if there was nothing in the world apart from Samuel and me. I guiltily relished in the feeling for a few fleeting moments, allowing the man I swore I hated to comfort me. When my sobs quieted, Samuel slowly unwrapped his arms from around me. He kept his grip on my shoulders though, holding me back a little to look at my face. I think it's time for bed. He spoke softly. My mother always told me things are much worse late at night. I nodded and allowed Samuel to lead me back to my room. In that moment, I didn't have control over my body or my thoughts. The reality that everyone was no longer looking for my mother was sinking in, and it was easier to let the numbness take over. He led me to the small bedroom, ushering me to sit on my bed. I obliged, tucking myself underneath the sheets as Samuel went to the dresser across from me. He pulled out sweats and tossed them toward me. I recognized them as my favorites, the ones that used to belong to my brother. Samuel told me HED had someone grab a few of my clothes, but I didn't know those had been in the mix. I smiled to myself as I grabbed the grey material, appreciating the small moment. Samuel closed my dresser and walked to the other side of the room, falling on a cream couch that sat underneath the window. It was hard to see much of the night with the light of the room glaring off the glass, but I noticed a few stars peeking around a full moon. Thanks, I told Samuel, tucking the clothes away for when he left. Anytime. Is there anything else you need? I shook my head. All right. He hesitated and glanced behind him, into the dark night. I furrowed my eyebrows. Everything. All of it. I know how much they mean to you. Samuel sighed and turned to look at me. Family is important. I smiled sadly, nodding in agreement. Why can't I go look for her? There's not much you could do. You can't be alone out there, and I don't want anyone hurting you. If someone took your mother, they could take you as well. Anything would be better than sitting around. I know. How much longer? Until I can leave the house? I mean, I'm not sure. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes and instead let out a large breath of air, puffing my cheeks as I did. Well, just let me know what the damned alpha says. Samuel chuckled lightly, though I could tell he was stressed. You really don't like him? Biting my lip, I carefully responded. Yes, just a lot. I lifted the sheets up to my chest, leaning against the dark headboard and allowing my body to fall into my pillows. Exhaustion was slowly grabbing hold of me, though I knew it was because of anything I'd done that day. The emotional stress of worrying about my family was enough to let sleep permanently take me in its tempting grasp. You know he would never hurt you. Right. Samuel started, shaking his head as I gave him a sad smile. Rye won't hurt you. He knows what you are to me. I nodded, my thoughts returning to Riley. It was my life I was worried about. His threats against my family, though nothing new to me, were still fresh on my mind. As my thoughts wandered through the conversations I'd had with him, I suddenly remembered a point of curiosity. I looked at Samuel carefully, trying to judge his reaction from my question. Who's Eden? Surprise filled Samuel's face. What brought that up? Urging him on. However, he only shook his head. How do you know about Eden? I don't. I've just heard the name a few times. He nodded, rubbing his neck in the process. Eden, Samuel started, but quickly trailed off. When he couldn't find the right words, he let out a sharp breath and caught my eye. Don't tell him I told you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My eyes widen slightly. Why? It's just a sensitive spot for him, and I'm not sure it's the best thing for you to know about. So why are you telling me? Samuel smiled. Because I don't want to keep things from you. I want you to trust me. My brow furrowed at his words. Samuel was a constant enigma, and had yet to figure it out. Who he was now was completely different from who he was before. He no longer came across as a terrifying wolf that would force me to bend to his will. And I was no longer afraid of Samuel. Some part of me, though deep within my soul, knew I could trust him. I doubt he will ever ask you about it. But just don't mention anything. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I nodded slowly, my brain trying to keep up. I was still fighting exhaustion, and I didn't want to miss this information he was going to give me. It was a worthy distraction for everything else going on. Samuel let out a large breath and looked around the room, wrapping his hands around his jaw. I could tell he didn't want to talk about this, but I didn't repeal my question. Eden was Riley's mate. Samuel eventually spoke. I tried to hold back a scoff, picturing the sadistic werewolf in love. Riley has a mate. Samuel sighed. Riley had a mate. Chapter 37 Eden. Samuel's words rang through the air for a long moment. I tried to process them as he stared at me, trying to read my thoughts as I was his. In my mind, thoughts and scenarios waterfalled, each one more intriguing than the last. They each brought up a new question and a new perspective on Riley. What happened? I initially asked. Samuel sighed again, twisting his fingers. She died. I nodded silently, my heart twisting at Samuel's tone. I was surprised by his statement, but I was still curious. Can I ask how? He looked at me for a moment, voice lowering. Then, he shook his head and lowly mumbled. Childbirth. My eyebrows shot up and I had to keep my jaw from dropping. To compensate, I took a long and deep breath through my nose. None of the situations that had just run through my head was anything like what Samuel was telling me. Riley has a child. No, Samuel shook his head. They both died. My eyes widened. I suddenly felt a small pain in my chest, though I was quite sure why. Riley was never anything but cruel to me. But the thought of anyone enduring that sort of grief was heartbreaking. It was enough to allow a small sliver of pity to enter my heart. However, the pain in my chest grew and it was beginning to feel like much more than pity. A deep and empty feeling was settling in the pit of my stomach, and I felt a huge piece of my heart breaking. I couldn't place why I was suddenly feeling this way until my eyes slowly lifted from my sheets to rest on Samuel. His face was as blank as a sheet of paper, and his frame was as still as an ocean of glass. However, I knew exactly what was beneath that facade. I'd seen it take over Samuel's features too many times not to know he was hiding another emotion. How I'd known that Samuel was feeling this way was beyond me, but I pushed that thought aside. I watched him carefully for a moment, planning my next words carefully. Did you know her? I questioned softly, already knowing the answer. The atmosphere in the room had drastically changed, and I suddenly felt as if I could do no more than whisper. He nodded. She was the first person I met when Riley brought me here. I was a mess, but she took care of me. Next to Riley, Eden was the first person I considered to be family. Then again, she was every owner's family. For the last few years, her and Riley ran the pack. I'm sorry, I whispered. She sounds wonderful. She was. Samuel smiled. She wasn't only perfect for Riley, but for everyone. She took care of the pack, but in no way did she baby us. He suddenly laughed, recalling a memory. She whipped me into shape when I got here. She was barely 18, but she still acted like she owned the place. I couldn't help but look up to her. I took a reprieve in the change of atmosphere, chuckling lightly at Samuel's comment. You needed whipping into shape. He shot me a wide grin. Believe it or not, I haven't always been this ruggedly handsome and confident. I laughed for real this time, and that only seemed too wide in Samuel's grin. What can I say? Eden knew her stuff. I rolled my eyes. That's one way of putting it. We laughed together, letting a brief and comfortable silence fall when we were through. And like times from before, I didn't feel the need to shy away from this silence or ask Samuel to leave me be. The more we spoke, the more I felt the pit in my stomach disappear. It made no sense, but I could tell Samuel was feeling the same way. I quickly brushed the thought aside as a neutral pity for Riley, knowing it could be nothing more. Eventually, Samuel broke the silence. His tone was no longer sorrowful or troubled, but tired and drained. We're recovering, you know, but the whole pack took everything pretty hard. Riley, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He shifted his weight. You don't just get over losing your mate. When did it happen? He thought for a moment. Just over a year ago. I raised my eyebrows once more. I didn't know it was that recent. Samuel shrugged his shoulders, rolling them at the same time. It did little to relieve the stress etched into his joints. It's been a hell of a year. The pack's doing better, but Riley is still adjusting. I hesitated, biting my lip, before slowly saying, "He seems fine to me." It was meant to come out as more of a question, but I failed miserably at hiding my suspicions. Riley didn't seem like he was dealing with the loss of his soulmate. Rather, he was happily carrying on with his superior life. Samuel eyed me warily. He raised an eyebrow as he spoke his next few words. "You see what he wants you to see. Riley still has an entire pack to take care of. He can't just break down and leave them." "Oh," I breathed, biting my... "Well, why didn't you just take over for him?" Samuel sighed. Heavily, his shoulders slumped forward ever so slightly, and he stopped fiddling his fingers. "I'm not an alpha. Samantha. Why not?" He looked up at me, head tilting. "You don't know how anything like that works, do you?" Suddenly self-conscious. Because I grew up isolated from the wolves. I knew nothing about the way the lives or the hierarchy worked. Sure, I knew the basics, but beyond that was nothing more than a mystery I previously had no desire to solve. Now, however, I was realizing that this was knowledge I needed to know. If I was going to spend my life with Samuel, it would benefit me to know how that life worked. "I know the basics," I told him, looking at my hands. He laughed once at my response, but his voice was still tired. "Riley is the alpha, and so was his father. He'd have to die for another alpha to take his place. So it follows the family." I questioned Samuel, and he nodded. "Well, what if there's no family when alpha dies? Then the beta would become the alpha." He paused, then added, "The chiefs would have to approve it first. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I rubbed my forehead. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Samuel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. His mouth hung half open, like it usually did, as he searched for the right words. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He started slowly. "It's basically like the alpha, you know, but higher. They take care of other alphas and their packs if there are disputes or something of the sorts." "I had no idea there were more of you," I grumbled. It was meant to sound bitter, but it came out more of an afterthought. "That's not even the half of it, Samantha." He laughed. I puffed my cheeks with air and let that out. Slowly. "That's enough for me. For now. Moving on." "I know. This is all a lot," I said more to myself than Samuel. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He caught it, and he gave me a small smile. You'll be out of here soon enough and then it'll get better. Keeping my thoughts to myself. In all honesty, I didn't think it would ever. It would just get manageable. We'd find my mother, and that would make things slightly easier. But after that, my life would consist of pleasing to werewolves. Silence fell once more, and my mind wandered. It ran through all the events that led me here, and I couldn't help but feel a loss for the girl that ran away. As I looked back on everything, it suddenly seemed like she was gone. And then, I realized the moment she left was the moment Triley threatened my family. Life was no longer about getting out of this town and finding a way to fight back, but being trapped here to walk on eggshells the rest of my life. So that girl and that fire had died out. The burning desire to escape and create something better was replaced with a burning fear of what would happen if I made a mistake. What are you thinking? Samuel suddenly spoke, his face scrunched into an unreadable expression. When I looked up, I found him watching me. I hesitated with my answer, knowing that lying to him would only cause him to ask again. So, I told him half of the truth, hoping it would work. Riley. He nodded, eyes softening. Achia's changed. You know, since everything happened. Achia's not the same as he was before. Samuel slowly stood up and began walking back and forth along the length of the couch. Eden had a way of forcing Riley to be his best. He still talks about her like she's here. That's probably where you heard her name. Samuel trailed off, shaking his head and dismissing the thought. Throws a lot of people off. It's best if you just don't comment on it. I thought for a moment of the Riley that I knew, trying not to cringe. All he did was threaten me and my family, and force me to obey his will. On the surface, he seemed like a controlling and manipulative werewolf who did anything to get what he wanted. Riley being any different than that was a foreign and unbelievable notion. What was he like with Edith around? I questioned. Samuel paused his steps. He was more grounded. I mused over the word, but before I could think for too long, Samuel was interrupting my thoughts with his own. Why are you so afraid of him? He began walking again, tucking his hands behind his back as he awaited my answer. His question caught me off guard, ere I stuttered before spitting out the first thing that came to my mind. Achia's intimidating. Samuel gave me a look, and I knew he didn't believe me. I've told you that you don't have to be afraid of him. I know. So why are you? What am I what? I questioned, giving myself a few moments to calculate my response. Afraid of him. Samantha. I could almost hear him rolling his eyes. I've told you. Yes, just a lot. That doesn't tell me anything. Playing his comment off and redirecting his attention. It was always the best way to distract him. Why do you do everything he says? Because H's an alpha. So, I questioned, trying to hold back a scoff. Samuel's step faltered, but he continued as if my comment was something he heard every day. Because H's my alpha. I mimicked his earlier words. That doesn't really tell me anything. He laughed once, then suddenly stopped his pacing and turned to face me. He tilted his head, as an unreadable expression laced its way onto his face. Why do you keep doing that? He thoughtfully questioned, his brief smile fading. I furrowed my eyebrows, not following his abrupt change in thought. Doing what? Redirecting the conversation. Refusing to speak your mind. I raised my eyebrows, complete and utter surprise filling me. That was something I expected Samuel to pick up on, and now that he had, I was sure what to do. Holding back my thoughts was the only way to make sure he didn't find out what I really thought about everything. If he did know, it'd be the end for me and my family. Eventually, I muttered, I don't know what you're talking about. Samuel rolled his eyes. Yes, you do. No, I don't. He raised an eyebrow, giving me a clear look. I only shrugged my shoulders, keeping his gaze. If I broke away, it was a clear sign that he had one, and I cowed into Samuel thinking I was lying in any way. After a few tense moments, he shook his head, looking around the room. You can be extremely difficult. You know that. I rolled my eyes, allowing my shoulders to relax. and you can be extremely cryptic." Then added, with a smirk, "See, I just spoke my mind." Samuel laughed and walked around the bottom of my bed, hesitating before moving any further. "You know," resting his hand on the wooden post, "you can tell me anything." My breath hitched in my throat as a weight settled on my chest. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean just that. You can tell me anything." "Okay." I trailed off, where he didn't move or say anything. I knew he was expecting something more from me. I racked my brain for something he'd want to hear but kept coming up empty. I didn't think it was possible he knew about Riley's threats to me, or he wouldn't be asking me so calmly to divulge something. Then again, Samuel had a peculiar relationship with Riley, and I could never pin either of them down. "I don't know what you want me to say," I finally sighed, looking anywhere but at Samuel. He shook his head as if he were processing difficult information. "I know it's not great being locked up in here, and I'll talk to Riley to see how much longer that will be. I know you're stressed about your mother, and I'm doing everything I can to find her. I know all of this is a lot for you, and I'm trying to make it better. But if something else is going on, I need to know so I can fix it." I bit my lip, noting his frustration. "There's nothing else." However, when I said that, Samuel rolled his eyes, shaking his head again, exaggerated. I quickly defended myself, repeating my statement. "There's nothing else." My voice raised slightly, betraying my true feelings. Samuel scoffed. "Right. Well, when you want to tell me, I'm all ears." "Samantha." I was surprised by the amount of bitterness in his tone, and it took me a moment to catch up. My next question came out before I could stop myself, and I was suddenly digging my grave deeper and deeper with every passing moment. "Why does this bother you so much?" "What?" "The fact that something is clearly wrong and you won't tell me." I held my breath. "I don't know what you want me to say." I held up my hands. "It's really fine. I've just got a lot on my mind. Why don't you tell me?" "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "There's nothing to talk about. You know everything that's going on. I'm just stressed about my mom, and Will, and the fact that James could be out there. It's just not going to hurt you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "I know. Like I said, there's nothing to talk about." Samuel was quiet for a moment, and I held my breath, waiting for his words. I knew he was going to fully buy what I was giving him, but it had to be enough. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I just need you to know I'm here for you." "I know," I told him, and it wasn't entirely fake. I knew Samuel's statement was true. Achidi proved that Achidi never leave my side. No matter the cost, he would do whatever it took to make sure, in his eyes, I was okay. The only problem was that we didn't always see eye to eye, and there was no way of fixing that. Samuel sighed heavily. "It's getting late. We should sleep." His voice was tired again, and I knew I didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. Instead of responding, I simply nodded and tucked myself deeper into my blankets. Samuel muttered a good night before leaving my room, closing the door behind him. The silence of the bedroom immediately crept into my senses, and it was slightly unnerving. Where there was silence, there was time to think and worry, and those were the last things I wanted to do. Chapter 38. Something's happened. The room was dark and still. Hours had passed since Samuel left, and in that time he'd easily fallen asleep. I would have still been asleep if it weren't for the incessant slew of noises coming from just beyond my door. It had only been a few minutes ago that I'd woken up from another nightmare to the sounds of doors opening and closing and Samuel cursing, too drained to move. I stayed lying in bed, listening to his voice grow in anger. After a while, it was clear I was going back to sleep, and Samuel was going to cease his increasingly loud tantrum. Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as I did. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was barely a few hours into the night, and nowhere near morning. This sent a spark of annoyance through my heart. Just as a loud and harsh thud was heard outside my door, I annoyedly stalked towards it, intending to peek outside my room and give Samuel the glare of the century. When I opened my door, however, I stopped in my tracks. The harsh and white light of the kitchen initially burned my eyes, but when they adjusted, I had to take a step back from the scene before me. Samuel was wildly pacing the kitchen and living room, knocking everything over in his path as he did. His phone was held tightly to his ear and he spoke into it furiously. His hair was wildly out of place and the only thing he wore was a long pair of black sweatpants. I made a small noise as he knocked over another bar stool, retreating further into my room. However, the moment the noise left my lips, Samuel stopped dead in his tracks and turned to face me. His features softened immediately, though his eyes still burned with anger. Samantha, still holding the phone to his ear. His attention was drawn away from me when the voice on the other end responded. Samuel's features quickly darkened once more, and he turned away as he snarled into the phone. I couldn't catch what he was saying, but after another minute, he hung up. As he slipped the small device into his pocket, he held out his hands and slowly walked towards me. I immediately pulled the blanket tighter around myself, flinching back from his large and raging frame. This didn't faze him though, and it was as if he'd been expecting my reaction. "What's going on?" I called out as he continued slowly walking towards me. My eyes darted around the room, eyeing all the turned-over furniture, then back to the man who was obviously the culprit. I knew from the way he walked that Samuel was anything but calm and I didn't want him anywhere near me. Samuel caught my gaze, and as if reading my mind, stopped walking. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm fine." My eyes scanned his body, and I could see that he was struggling to ease the tension in each muscle. We stood at an impasse for a moment, neither of us moving, as his hands clenched into fists then relaxed at his side. I knew he wouldn't move again without my permission, so after a while, I stiffly nodded and repeated my earlier question, "What's going on?" Almost immediately after I nodded, Samuel began walking towards me again. It was even slower this time, and it felt as if he was waiting for me to run away. But I stayed rooted in place. This meant little to Samuel because even when I did, he came only as far as the kitchen counter closest to my door. He then stopped and leaned against it, folding his arms. Something's happened. Watching me carefully, my heart fell out of my chest, and I half cried, "What's wrong? Why don't you sit down?" He abruptly turned from me and picked up the bar stool he'd knocked over, gesturing for me to take a seat. I numbly heeded his words, waiting for him to speak again. However, Samuel seemed at a loss. His face held a distant scowl, and as he resumed his closed, off stance from before. His anger from earlier was just on the surface, and it was hard to tell he was still fighting to keep it at bay. "Is he all right?" I questioned, watching his features contort with different emotions. "No." I took a deep breath. "Is he dead?" Samuel closed his eyes. "Not yet." My breathing increased as my heart started beating rapidly. I tried my best to keep my composure, but I knew that if Samuel didn't tell me what happened soon, I would lose it. "What happened?" Samuel's voice was harsh. "I don't know. I have no idea how it happened. I didn't know anything had even happened." But he hesitated, stiffly rubbing the back of his neck. "Will shifting. Shifting?" I repeated, letting out a half, crazed laugh. "Shifting? Into what? One of you?" I shook my head fervently. "That's not possible. You're insane." He was bitten, Samantha, quite a while ago. It's been in his system long enough that it's starting to take over. My jaw was left hanging half open as my eyes widened. Samuel's words were left suspended in the air, waiting for me to catch hold of them. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I refused. "That's not possible. She has been in the hospital this whole time. She has been asleep this whole time. There's no way anyone could have gotten to him. My voice was growing louder with each question that left my mouth as I tried, desperately, to deny what Samuel was telling me. Why would anyone want Will? Wouldn't someone have noticed the bite? Why didn't anyone say anything? I was in hysterics now, repeating the same sentences over and over again. At some point during my small breakdown, Samuel walked over to my chair, pulled me off, and into his arms. They did little to calm me, as enough tension for the both of us was straining his muscles. After a moment of standing there in his arms, what Samuel was saying had finally sunk in. Then, it all made sense. The sudden and miraculous healing Will had done in the days that he'd been gone. The fact that he needed no more surgeries, or anything, to aid him in the process. The only thing we'd been waiting for Will to do was to wake up. And now that he finally was, it was in the worst way possible. Where is he? I let out half a yell, pushing back against Samuel's chest. He immediately let go of me, but still held me at arm's length. When he didn't answer my question, I repeated myself, fully letting out a scream. Where is he? Samuel closed his eyes. The doctor sedated him, but Riley is on his way over there right now. Achia's going to take care of it. Take care of it. My eyes widened, and I immediately gripped Samuel's arms harshly. Riley can't do anything to him. We have to go and get him, now. I ripped myself away from Samuel, much to his surprise. Before he could grab me, I ran to my bedroom and threw the blanket on the ground, grabbing a sweatshirt in the same motion as I reached for my shoes. However, Samuel caught up. Samantha, just calm down. Riley's not going to hurt him. Samuel grabbed my shoes from the floor, and I frantically reached for them. He danced around me though, bringing us both back out into the kitchen. Give me my shoes, I demanded, my voice growing louder by the second. When he refused and held them high above his head, I screamed in frustration. However, I didn't let that deter me. Before Samuel knew what was happening, I dove around him and sprinted for the front door. I heard my shoes drop to the ground as Samuel jumped after me, easily catching hold of my wrist. Let go. Crying now. H.E.S. going to kill him. I have to get to him before Riley does. Samuel stilled, complete and utter confusion taking the place of his anger. My words rang sharply through the air, and he looked at me like I was half mad. In reality, I knew exactly what was going on. Somehow, it'd screwed up, and Riley was going to kill my brother as consequence. When I tried to make another run for it, Samuel grabbed my other hand and rooted me firmly in place. Samantha, he commanded as I continued fighting against his grip. When I didn't calm down, he repeated himself, matching my screams. Samantha, look at me. His change in tone sent my body still as a stone. Slowly, I brought my eyes back to him, despite wanting to be thousands of miles away. When I met his gaze, I was surprised to see his eyes were still the dark abyss of blue and black. Not a hint of another color there. He looked into my own eyes for a fleeting second before taking a deep breath, calming himself. When he spoke, his voice was low, threatening to release another yell. You have to calm down. I took a shaky breath, letting his words wash over me. For both our sakes, I needed to do as Samuel said. However, the thought that Riley was going after my brother, probably at this very minute, was enough to send my heart racing, and I realized I couldn't calm down. I had to focus this energy on finding Will. Silence fell as Samuel breathed heavily. I desperately tried to follow his example, but confusion and horror clouded my thoughts. I hopelessly tried to figure out what could have caused Riley to go after my brother. In my mind, Riley being behind all of this was the only reasonable explanation. HED had to have been the one to bite him, or at the very least, gotten someone else to do it. No one else could have gotten to him in the hospital. But it didn't make sense. It'd done everything he asked me. It kept Samuel happy. There was no reason he should be going after my family. Samuel breathed with me for another moment, before loosening his grip on my wrists. "Now," he started, closing his eyes for a moment. "Why don't you explain to me what's going on? What are you talking about?" I shrilly cried, immediately betraying the fact that I'd done little to calm myself. Samuel gave me a hard look, his eyes doing little to hide his frustration. I quickly calmed my tone and took another shaky breath. "The only thing going on is that we need to go to Will." My voice came out eerily smooth. "Before Riley kills him." "Right." I bit my lip. "I just don't want Will getting hurt. We have to go to him." Samuel shook his head, deepening his frown lines. "There's something else you need to know. Samantha." He abruptly changed his tone to one that was softer and almost pleading. "We will go and see your brother. I promise you that. But we can't right now." My temper flared, but mostly out of fear and panic. "And why the hell not?" "There's multiple reasons." Samuel tried to keep his soft voice. "One being that it's not safe for you to be around him like this." My voice rose an octave, doing the exact opposite of Samuel's. "I thought you said he was sedated." He ignored my comment. "The other reason we can't go is that it's not safe out there tonight." "What is that supposed to mean?" "You remember that group of humans you were traveling with?" My brow furrowed. "I don't see. They're back. And they killed about a dozen of us." My heart stilled. "Why on earth would they come here?" Samuel sighed, and I knew he didn't want to tell me anything. I gave him a look, trying again to pull my wrists from his grasp. He let me go this time, but I stayed rooted in place, waiting to hear his explanation. "They were trying to get someone back," he delicately explained. Images flashed through my mind of the night Riley had come to save us from the humans. To my knowledge, almost all of them had died. Then, I remembered the bloodied hand riding back to town with us who... I whispered, the memories clouding my voice. "I don't know their names." I sighed heavily, folding my arms across my chest while glancing at the door behind Samuel. "Look, I don't care about them. I care about Will. Archie's in trouble and I've got to help him. He can't be shifting. He won't survive. We don't know that," he firmly stated. "And Archie's not in trouble. Riley will be there when he wakes up." My breath caught in my throat, and it suddenly felt as if the world was crashing around me. I tried to speak, to tell Samuel that Riley was the last person I wanted Will to see when he woke up. But no words would come. Samuel noticed, and he hesitantly ran his fingers up my arm. "Archie's not going to hurt Will." "Samantha." I shook my head, tears forming in my eyes once more. "My brother was as good as dead." Samuel gently gripped my upper arm, pulling me closer to him. "Why don't you believe me?" My breath came out in shortened, shaking huffs, and I used that as an excuse to ignore Samuel's question. The tears were falling from my eyes now, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. "I just need to see Will," I eventually told Samuel, who had been waiting patiently for my answer. He closed his eyes, giving me a tired and hopeless smile. "I know. Chapter 39, I have to go." "I know," Samuel told me. "Then why can't we go?" I questioned, angrily wiping away my tears. Samuel's hand that was resting on my arm flicked forward, but he sighed and dropped it from me completely. "I told you, it's not safe." I shook my head. "Will would never hurt me." Samuel looked at me, and I could have sworn I saw an ounce of pity in his eyes. Before I could catch it, he looked at the ceiling, avoiding my gaze. "Will's not going to be himself." "I don't understand." My voice cracked as I spoke, but I chose to ignore it. I also chose to ignore the fact that all the knowledge I previously had about humans shifting was suddenly nowhere to be found. It had been replaced by sheer and utter panic that was slowly clouding my thoughts, throwing anything and everything else out the window. Right now, there's a wolf in Will that is trying to get out. Considering how long Archie's had that bite, it's going to be a strong one. Will's not going to be in control of his actions. "What do you mean, how long Archie's had the bite?" I questioned, frantically. "Who bit him? Why am I just now finding out?" Then, I paused. A sudden, red, hot fury entering my chest. It pressed down heavily against me, weighing enough to stop my breathing and irrational thought. Ever so slowly, I looked up at Samuel and seized my next words. Did you know? Of course not. Samuel immediately shot his gaze back to me, eyebrows raising. It was hard to notice my sudden change of attitude, and Samuel realized I was ready to snap if he said the wrong words. He proceeded slowly, watching for any sign that I might lose it. Samantha, I would never keep that from you. Somehow, I knew he was telling the truth, but the fire was still alight in my heart. It wanted someone to blame. It wanted a reason to scream. Who bit him? Samuel was eyeing me warily, watching my chest rapidly rise and fall. We don't know for sure. We won't know until he shifts. My lips twisted into a disgusted scowl. I believed Samuel, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, though I didn't blame him. And somehow, I knew he was telling me the truth. The only thing I could think about was that it was his alpha that had caused this. It had to have been. Riley biting was the only explanation. He was the current source of all my suffering, and he would be forever. I didn't realize it at first, but my rational thinking was suddenly nowhere to be found. It was replaced by a feeling stronger than anything I'd ever before felt. A resentment so strong that it buried itself in my very core. It started in my chest, then seemed to bleed into every one of my veins, coursing through my body until there was nothing left but pure and raw hatred. Samuel suddenly took a step back, causing me to turn my glare on him. However, when I rested my bitter stare on him, he was glaring back. A look of concern mixed with confusion flashed in his eyes, and his mouth hung half open with an unspoken thought. What? I snapped. He shook his head, quickly recovering his steps. He eyed me for another moment, before slowly speaking. His voice came out smooth and level, attempting to lull me into a coma state. Samantha, you have every right to be angry. I won't tell you otherwise. But we must keep a level head about this. If we're going to find who did it, we need to stay calm. I know who did it. I snarled. James. Samuel hesitantly questioned. I knew there was more to his question, but he didn't elaborate. I bit my lip once more, my scowl deepening. No, he has been gone for too long. Though James was a likely culprit, it was much easier for me to go after Riley. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The one who threatened my family. There was holding him back from turning my brother and using it as leverage against me, just like there was nothing stopping him from taking my mother. Samuel pursed his lips before slowly responding. He watched me discreetly, waiting for the moment I would snap. Like I said, Will's had this bite for a while. How long? My voice was harsh, and it almost made me want to cower away from it. How Samuel stood before me, taking the full brunt of my fury, was beyond me. We don't know exactly. It looks like it happened a few days after we got back. James was gone by then. Samuel nodded once. When he didn't say anything else, I had to hold back a scoff. Someone would have caught him if he went to the hospital. Someone would have said something. They knew he was the one who put Will in there in the first place. That's something else. Samantha. Samuel closed his eyes, avoiding my burning gaze. Riley knew when it happened. The doctors called him. They'd seen someone in Will's room and found the bite. My heart stilled. As Samuel's words sank in, my world began to fall to ruins. If what he was saying was true, then that meant when I went to see Will, Achidi probably already been bitten, and it had no idea. My own brother had been suffering from a bite and I had absolutely no idea. I was naive enough to believe that Achidi healed that much on his own, that some sort of kind mercy was out there long enough to allow my brother to come back to me. I stood in stunned silence for a moment as Samuel slit open his eyes. His entire body was tensed, much like my own, but his eyes were trained on me. Once more, as I stared back at him, My resolve crumbled. I tried to speak, but my voice came out much weaker than intended. I meant to sound accusatory, scornful, disbelieving, but none of those emotions were made manifest. My voice was cold and dead. You're telling me you didn't know? Samuel tightly clenched his jaw. Bridie didn't tell me. Why not? Because I was taking care of you. Silence fell. I didn't know what to say to his words, and it seemed like Samuel had nothing else to tell me. Pieces of my heart were slowly breaking away, each one falling somewhere they would never resurface. A piece fell for my brother. A piece fell for my mother. A chunk was torn away from my sanity. Then, finally, a fraction of a piece fell for Samuel too. I didn't want to focus on it, but I knew he was hurt by Riley's actions. They were brothers. If I guessed correctly, this would be the first time Riley hid something from Samuel, and he was taking it well. I'm sorry, I whispered before I could stop myself. Don't be. This isn't about me. Samuel sighed. But I'm going to make sure we find whoever did this. If it was James or not. James' name swam through my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to push the thought away, I knew Samuel was right. It was more than possible that James bit Will, even though Riley could have set the entire thing up, and the better part of me wanted to believe this. Something in me knew that was the case. The small piece of sanity still left in me forced my brain back to rational thinking. That I realized something. Riley had no motive. He'd done nothing wrong. If Riley were the one to take my mother and bite Will, it would only result in furthering my hatred for him and Samuel. That was exactly what he didn't want. I knew Riley was manipulative, conniving, and sadistic, but I didn't think he was reckless enough to throw away what he set up with me. With my mother gone and Will a wolf, his leverage was thrown away. On top of that, he had to control a newly shifting werewolf with no prior knowledge of the fact that it was going to happen. A first shift was something the pack prepared for. One that happened unexpectedly never ended well for anyone. Even if Riley knew. The pack didn't, and that was enough to cause panic. Then again, James had no motive that I could see. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. As far as anyone knew, he left town to escape the wrath of Samuel. Coming back here and risking his neck to turmoil was something anyone with a rational mind would do. James had plenty of opportunities to turn us before, and that is the very reason we were ostracized from the pack. He refused. He didn't want the responsibility of the children, on top of his mate, so risking his life to do so now made absolutely no sense. A shrill ringing suddenly sounded through the trash department, and Samuel and I both snapped our gazes to his pocket. He called out his cell phone, answering it with a rough voice. He didn't say anything after that, but hung up after a moment, and sighed. I have to go. My jaw dropped, and my anger immediately resurfaced. What do you mean you have to go? I'm going to help Will. Riley's there now, but he needs help. The humans are still somewhere in the territory as well, so I've got to get Bray and a team together to find them. As he spoke, he typed something quickly into his phone. I'm coming with you. I have to help Will. Samuel sighed, looking at me with sad eyes. We've been over this. Samantha, you're going to get hurt. Will could kill you. I shook my head, crossing my arms. He wouldn't do that. And if you're going, I'm going. I won't be left here alone. Not all my brothers out there being killed. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You can't force me to stay here. Samuel mimicked my posture. Your brother will be fine. No one is going to kill him. I'm going to help pray, and he'll be fine. I closed my eyes, forcing back the tears that never seemed to want to leave. After a moment, my voice softened, and I resolved to beg. Samuel was responding to my harsh or accusatory tone, and I was desperate to find a way out of this apartment. I couldn't leave Will alone. If he was waking up to be a werewolf, I needed to be there. If he was going to die, I needed to be there. There was no way around it. Please, let me go with you. I won't get in the way. It'll help. I'll stay behind you the entire time. I'm sorry. Samantha. He opened his phone once more, typing another message before continuing. It's not worth putting you at risk. You're still not even fully healed. My attention turned momentarily to the stitches just above my hip. They were burning, as usual, but the feeling only added to my earlier anger. It did nothing to hinder me, and the past few days had been pivotal in my healing process. We both know I'm fine. Please, I'm begging you, let me go with you. I'm sorry, Samantha. A sudden knock was heard at the door, and Samuel and I both turned to face it. The next moment, the door was being opened and two figures walked slowly into the apartment. The first figure I immediately recognized as Peyton Bray. He was towing someone behind him, a girl that I'd never before seen. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Peyton spoke, his gaze darting between Samuel and me. His icy blue eyes seemed to scream with amusement as he judged the clear tension in the air. Samuel sighed, but didn't relax his posture. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Bray. Good. He grunted, pushing the girl behind him forward. I've got your company here, and we're ready to go. I've gathered a few men already, but we'll need more than what I've got. We need a plan. I've got one. Peyton nodded and turned towards the front door, leaving the girl standing awkwardly next to the turned-over sofa. Samuel took a step towards him, then hesitated, silently debating something. There'll be 1 minute. He ultimately spoke, his eyes glancing at me. I refused to meet Samuel's gaze but watched Peyton as he paused, and half turned to face Samuel. We need to leave. The men are waiting for us. Riley's waiting. Samuel's tone immediately changed. He growled suddenly, taking a small step forward. I said I'll be out in a minute. Bray, they can wait. Peyton stiffened, his grip on the doorknob tightening. His face went blank for a moment before he let a small and fake smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes and looked more disturbing than anything. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Beta, he'll be waiting outside. With his final words, Peyton left and slammed the door behind him. I stood watching what HED just stood, motionless, as the tension in the air did nothing but rise. I was half tempted to run after Peyton, but before I could, Samuel stepped in front of me. I have to go. Samantha. I didn't want to look at him, but I found my gaze traveling up to meet his. Samuel's eyes were sad, but they held a determination I knew I couldn't argue with. Silently, I bowed my head and cursed his name. I'd find a way to get to Will, with or without Samuel's help. In leaving Raven with you, Samuel continued, jutting his jaw out to the girl Peyton brought in. She was giving us a moment, busying herself with turning the heavy couch back over. So please don't do anything stupid. Here's a phone. As well, it has my number in it. And Raven can tell you how to use it, if necessary. I'll keep you updated. He took my hand and firmly placed something small into my palm. Before I could glance at the phone, Samuel took my other hand and brought it to my face. His hand enveloped mine and my jaw, and a look of tenderness glazed over his features. However, I ignored Samuel's actions, gripping the phone in my other hand and shoving it into my pocket. I'll be back by sunrise. Please, please don't do anything. Just wait for me. Samuel desperately searched my eyes for some sort of acknowledgement or promise, but I gave him none. I refused to sit idly by while he went after Will without me. I refused to accept the fact that he was leaving me behind. Don't be upset with me. Trying one last time to change Samuel's mind. I cheers all I have. Samuel, please. I looked up at him, my eyes clouding with tears. I didn't fight them this time, hoping they would prove to Samuel just how desperate I was to see my brother. Samuel closed his eyes and tightened his lips. I'll make sure it's okay. Samantha, I'll get through this. I stayed silent. When he saw I was going to answer, Samuel sighed. He straightened his posture, walking past me and towards the front door. His hand rested on the knob for a moment as his face half-turned toward me. I could see his jaw hanging open, but before he said anything, Samuel shook his head and left, knocking the door behind him.